Have you ever done everything right? Every single thing, and still ended up standing outside a door that used to be yours? I have. And it took me a long time to admit that the person who closed that door on me was my own son. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 63 years old. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia, in the same house where I raised my son Owen for 22 years. The backyard still has the tire swing his father hung the summer before the accident. I've never taken it down. I don't know if I ever will. My husband Frank died in the winter of 2009. Black ice on the Coquihalla, the kind that looks like wet pavement until it's too late. Owen was 17. He was in the middle of a hockey season, doing well in school, starting to look like the man he was going to become. And then one phone call changed everything for both of us. I remember sitting on the edge of Owen's bed that night after the hospital. He was pretending to be asleep, but I could hear him breathing too hard, the way children breathe when they're trying not to cry. I put my hand on his shoulder and he grabbed it and held on without saying a word. We stayed like that for a long time. I made a promise that night, not out loud, just to myself, and maybe to Frank, that I would not let our son fall apart, that whatever I had to do, whatever it cost me, I would make sure Owen came out of this okay. And I meant every bit of it. Frank had a modest life insurance policy. Not a fortune, but enough that if I was careful, I could keep the house and put something aside for Owen's future. I went back to work full-time at the physiotherapy clinic, where I'd worked part-time before the accident. I took on Saturday shifts. I packed lunches and skipped dinners out, and wore the same winter coat for 6 years because it was still functional, and there were better uses for that money. Owen graduated. Got into the business program at UBSO. I helped with tuition. He was smart, driven, and charming in that easy way some people are born with. Teachers liked him. Coaches liked him. Everyone liked Owen. He graduated at 22, got a job in commercial real estate, and within 3 years was making more money than I had ever made in my life. I was proud in a way that I don't have the words for. Genuinely, completely proud. And then he met Serena Blackwell. I want to be fair here, because I've spent 2 years turning this story over in my mind, and I know my own feelings can distort things. Serena was beautiful and polished, and she had the kind of quiet authority that makes people straighten their posture when she walks into a room. Owen was head over heels from the first week. I could see it. The way he talked about her, the way he watched her face when she spoke. I met her for the first time at a restaurant in downtown Kelowna. She was perfectly pleasant. Warm, even. She asked me questions about my work, complimented my earrings, laughed at the right moments. I drove home thinking she seemed lovely. The wedding was the following June. I offered to contribute what I could toward the cost, and Owen accepted without much discussion. I wrote a check for $12,000. It was not money I had lying around. It came from the savings I had been building slowly and carefully for almost a decade. But I didn't hesitate, because that's what you do when your child gets married. You show up. You give what you can. They bought a house in West Kelowna the next spring. 4 bedrooms, a double garage, a kitchen with an island I could have parked a car on. It was beautiful. It was also well beyond what Owen's salary alone could carry, especially with Serena working only part-time at her sister's interior design studio. But they seemed to manage. I didn't ask too many questions. The first time Owen called to ask for money, he framed it as a short-term thing. They'd had a larger-than-expected property tax bill and were just a little short that month. Could I lend him $3,000? He'd pay it back by fall. I sent the money the same day. He didn't pay it back by fall. I didn't bring it up. I told myself it was fine. He was building a life. Things were tight for young people now, the cost of living, the housing market. I knew all of this. I gave him room. Over the next 18 months, the requests became more regular. Never framed as requests exactly, more like mentions. The car needs new brake pads, and the estimate came back higher than expected. The basement is getting some moisture and we really should address it before winter. Owen would say these things almost in passing, and I would hear what was underneath them, and I would offer to help before he had to ask directly. I think, looking back, that this arrangement suited everyone perfectly. He never had to feel like he was asking. I never had to feel like I was being asked. And Serena never had to be involved at all. But she was involved. I understand that now. My granddaughter Charlotte was born in October. I had driven down to Kelowna General the morning. Serena went into labor, and I sat in the waiting room for 7 hours, with a terrible coffee and a magazine I didn't read. When Owen came out to get me, his eyes were red and he was smiling in a way I had never seen on his face before. He took me in to meet her, Charlotte. 6 pounds, 9 ounces. Dark hair, which surprised me because Owen had been so blonde as a baby. She was making small fussing sounds, and Serena was holding her with this careful, exhausted focus that I recognized from the first hours of my own motherhood. I stood at the edge of the bed and I said, "She's perfect," and I meant it with every cell in my body. I asked if I could hold her. Serena said she was still settling, and it was better not to pass her around too much, just yet. I said, of course, whenever you're ready." I went home that evening without having held my granddaughter. I told myself it was just the first day. New mothers are protective. It's instinct. It's completely normal, and I should not read anything into it, but the pattern continued. Over the next 4 months, I visited 8 times. I brought meals. I brought groceries. I offered to come and sit with Charlotte in the evenings so Serena could sleep. More often than not, Serena would be elsewhere when I arrived. At her sister's studio, at a yoga class, running errands, and Owen would greet me at the door looking slightly uncomfortable in a way I had learned to recognize. There was always a reason I couldn't hold Charlotte for long. She'd just gone down. She was gassy and fussy and overstimulated. Serena had a particular way she liked things done. On my 5th visit, I sat on their couch for 2 hours while Charlotte slept in a bassinet 4 feet away from me, and I was told not to pick her up because she'd finally settled after a hard morning. I sat there, and I looked at my granddaughter sleeping, and I did not pick her up. I drove home on the highway, and I cried so hard I had to pull over near the fruit stands on Highway 97. I did not say anything to Owen. I kept sending money when it was needed, and it was needed often. In March, Owen called to say they were thinking of doing a renovation, opening up the kitchen to the back deck, extending the living space. The contractor quote had come in at $38,000. He wasn't asking me to cover all of it, just a portion. Whatever I was comfortable with, I sent $15,000. I want to tell you when I started to understand what was actually happening. It wasn't one moment. It was more like a fog slowly clearing. My friend Paulette, who has known me since Owen was in diapers, came to visit me in April. We had dinner at my place, and I was telling her about the kitchen renovation, in a way that, even as I was speaking, I heard myself making excuses for things I hadn't examined too carefully. Paulette is the kind of person who listens completely before she says anything, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very gently, "Evelyn, have you kept track of how much you've given them?" I hadn't. Not really. I had a rough sense of it, but I'd been avoiding the full number the way you sometimes avoid stepping on a scale. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my bank statements and a notepad, and I added it up. $61,400 over 3 years. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about my coat, the one I'd worn for 6 years because there were better uses for the money. I thought about the savings I'd built from Saturday shifts and packed lunches, and all the small choices I'd made because I wanted to be there for my son when it mattered. I thought about sitting on that couch, 4 feet from my granddaughter, not allowed to pick her up. The next morning, I called Owen. I asked if we could have coffee, just the 2 of us. He said sure, sounded a bit distracted, and we met at a place near his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I want to tell you I went in calm and clear-headed, but that wouldn't be entirely true. I was calm on the outside because I had learned a long time ago how to hold difficult things steady on the outside. Inside, I was something else. I told him I needed us to talk about a few things. I started with Charlotte. I told him, as plainly and as kindly as I could, that I felt pushed away from my granddaughter, that 8 visits and only holding her twice was not something I could keep accepting, that I understood Serena had her ways of doing things, and I respected that, but I needed a real role in Charlotte's life, not a visitor role, a grandmother role. Owen shifted in his chair. He said Serena was still figuring out her boundaries around the baby. He said it wasn't personal. He said I needed to give it more time. I asked him how much time. He didn't answer. Then I told him I had added up what I'd given them over the past 3 years. He went very still. I said I wasn't asking for it back. That wasn't the point, and I wanted to be clear about that. But I needed him to understand that those were not small amounts for me. That money represented years of my own work and sacrifice, and I needed to know that it was going where I thought it was going, toward building a stable life for him, and Serena and Charlotte. He said of course it was. He looked offended that I'd suggested otherwise. I went home and sat with my unease for 2 weeks. Something was still not sitting right. I couldn't name it fully. Then I got a call from my neighbor Judith Hartley, who works in mortgage lending. We'd spoken at a block party the previous summer, and she'd mentioned she sometimes saw Owen's name come up in professional contexts. She'd been vague about it, the way people are when they're being professionally careful. But this time she called me directly, and her voice was careful in a different way. She told me she wasn't sure she should be telling me this. She said she'd wrestled with it. But she'd seen something that concerned her and she thought I deserved to know. Owen had been borrowing against the equity in the West Kelowna house, not through a standard bank channel, through a private lender, at a rate that Judith described as alarming. The amounts were significant, and they appeared to be servicing a debt that had nothing to do with renovations or property taxes or anything he had ever told me. I asked her what she thought the money was for. She said she didn't know for certain, but she'd seen this pattern before, and it usually pointed to one of two things. Either someone had a spending problem they were hiding, or someone had made a very bad investment and was trying to manage the fallout quietly. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. When I called Owen that evening, he could tell immediately that something had shifted. I didn't accuse him of anything. I asked him, as directly as I could without telling him how I'd found out. Whether there was something going on financially that he hadn't told me about, something beyond the day-to-day things he'd mentioned. He went quiet for a long time, and then, piece by piece, it came out. He had made a significant investment 2 years earlier in a private venture a colleague had recommended. It had collapsed. He had lost a substantial amount of their own savings. Rather than tell Serena, he had started trying to recover the loss quietly, through the private borrowing and through the money he'd been asking from me. Serena didn't know the real state of their finances. She thought the renovation money had come from an inheritance payout. Owen had told her Frank's estate had finally released. There was no inheritance payout. Frank's estate had been settled years ago. Owen had invented it. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. I just sat down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it was not a single thing. There was grief in it, the kind of grief that comes when you realize you've been loving someone at a distance from who they actually are. There was anger, quieter than I expected but more solid, and underneath all of it, there was something that I can only describe as a strange, exhausted clarity. Like finally seeing the room you've been standing in. I told Owen I needed a few days. He asked what that meant. I told him I would be in touch. I spent those days doing something I should have done years earlier. I spoke to my financial advisor, a methodical and kind man named Russell Tate, who had been gently raising his eyebrows at my account activity for some time, but had waited for me to ask. I told him everything. He was not surprised. He helped me understand what I had, what I'd given away, and what I needed to do going forward to make sure I would be okay in retirement. The picture was more serious than I had let myself acknowledge. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Oakes, and she was practical in the way that very good lawyers are, clear-eyed without being cold. I told her the full situation. She helped me understand my options. She also told me something I hadn't known, that some of what Owen had done, specifically misrepresenting financial circumstances to obtain money from me, could have legal implications. She suggested I document everything carefully and keep the records somewhere safe. I did all of that. Then I called Owen. I told him I loved him. I want to be clear that this is where I started, because it was true and it was the ground everything else stood on. I told him I loved him, and I was not going to abandon him, or refuse to help him find a way through this. But I told him the way things had been working could not continue. I told him I would no longer be sending money. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had to be honest. The money I'd given had not gone where I'd been told it was going, and I could not keep contributing to a situation I didn't understand and hadn't consented to fund. I told him he needed to tell Serena the truth about their finances. The whole truth. If they were going to find their way through this, It had to be on honest ground. I told him that my relationship with Charlotte was not negotiable. I was her grandmother. I expected to be treated as one. If Serena needed time to become comfortable with that, I was willing to have that conversation directly with her. But I would no longer accept being kept at arm's length from a child I loved and had every right to be part of. And I told him that if he wanted my help navigating what came next, finding a reputable financial advisor, understanding his options with the private lender, figuring out how to have the conversation with Serena. I was there for all of it, but it had to be honest. No more versions of the story designed to manage how I felt. I couldn't help someone I couldn't see clearly. Owen was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. Not a managed sorry. Not the kind designed to close the topic." It was shaky and it sounded like it cost him something, and I believed it. I said, "I know. Now let's figure out what comes next." What came next was not simple or fast. It never is. Owen told Serena everything over a weekend in early June. She called me the following Monday. Her voice was controlled in that way. That means someone has been crying for 2 days straight. She didn't apologize. Not immediately, not for all of it, but she said she hadn't known the full picture. She said she understood, now, why I had felt the way I had about Charlotte, and she was sorry for her part in that. It was a careful conversation, held together with effort on both sides. But it was honest, which was more than I'd had in a long time. I drove to West Kelowna that Saturday. Serena met me at the door. She had Charlotte on her hip, and without saying anything, she handed her to me. Charlotte was 7 months old by then. She had learned to grab things, and she grabbed my finger immediately with both hands, the way babies do, like they're testing whether you're real. I held her in the front hallway for a long time, and nobody rushed me. That was the beginning of something different. Owen worked out an arrangement with Russell Tate's guidance to address the private debt in a structured way. He had a very difficult conversation with the colleague who had recommended the original investment. That conversation, from what Owen told me, did not go well, but it needed to happen. He and Serena began seeing a financial counselor together. The renovation on the kitchen was put on hold indefinitely. I did not give any more money. I will not pretend that was easy for me. Because part of me, the part that sat on Owen's bed in the dark when he was 17 and held his hand, wanted to fix it, wanted to make it smaller and safer and more manageable. But Russell Tate was very clear with me, and I trusted him. Helping someone you love does not always mean carrying what they should be carrying themselves. I go to West Kelowna most Sundays now. I pick up Charlotte at 10 in the morning, and we go to Waterfront Park if the weather is right. Or we stay in and I read to her from the stack of picture books I've been building since before she was born. She reaches for me when I come through the door. She knows my face and she knows my voice, and she says something that sounds like Nana, even if we're still working out the pronunciation. I don't think Owen and I will ever fully return to what we were before all of this. I'm not sure we should. What we were before included too much that was hidden, too much I was willing to overlook because it was easier than looking at it directly. What we are now is more careful, more honest. There are conversations we have that we never had before, including some that are uncomfortable, which I have come to understand is actually a good sign. Serena and I have coffee once a month. It is not the easiest relationship I've ever had, but it is real, and I've come to prefer real over easy. My coat finally gave out last winter. The lining tore past the point of repair, and even I had to admit it was time. I went to the bay and I bought a new one, a warm one, a red one, which is not a color I would have chosen in another life, but I'm 63 years old and I've earned the right to a red coat. I want to say something to anyone out there who might be in a version of what I was in. Not necessarily the same details, but the same shape of it. The same feeling of giving and giving, while something important to you is being quietly withheld. The same practice of not asking too many questions because the answers might require you to act. You are allowed to love your family and still require them to be honest with you. You are allowed to give generously and also know where the money is going. You are allowed to be a grandmother, fully, properly, without apology or timetable. And you are allowed, I want to say this as clearly as I can, you are allowed to stop funding a life you are being shut out of. Not because love has conditions, but because it doesn't. Because the same love that made you work the Saturday shifts and write the checks and sit in the waiting room for 7 hours is the love that requires you to finally stand up and say, I am here, I matter. And we are going to do this honestly or not at all. That's not the end of love. That's what love looks like when it finally stops being afraid. Charlotte laughed at me last Sunday. Genuinely laughed, the way babies do when something delights them. I had made a face at her, and she just laughed and looked at me like I was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. I thought about the couch, the 4 feet, the bassinet, the highway pull-off near the fruit stands, and then I made the face again, and she laughed again, and that was enough. That was everything.